Two, the ideas that shape America, or I believe the PowerPoint's titled A Nation of Ideas. This is that slide in chapter one that we talked about, those different ideas that kind of define who we are as a country. In this chapter, we're just going to go into those ideas a little bit more and look at, do they still represent America? Are we still upholding these ideas, or do we even understand what those ideas mean? So, a nation of ideas. This terminology comes from the notion that the Constitution, when our founding fathers created the United States, they were putting a lot of ideas down on paper that really hadn't been put down in this way before. Our country is founded on democracy and having a republic and everyone being equal and things like that. These aren't notions and ideas that really dictated how government worked really anywhere else in the world at this time. On July 4th, we draft the Declaration of Independence in 1776. The Declaration of Independence was essentially our letter to the King of England saying that we were no longer going to be a British colony, that we were breaking away from England, and we were going to make our own nation. And there's the most popular idea put down in the Declaration of Independence is that Americans believed they were entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, what does that really mean? What is a right to liberty? What is a right to the pursuit of happiness? What does that mean in practice? And so a lot of these ideas get defined in the Constitution, and then some of them are left open, for interpretation. And then, we as an individual, I could ask every one of you, what does liberty mean to you? And I would get as many different answers as there are people. So many of them we don't agree on. We don't agree on what those ideas mean. But the Declaration of Independence and then shortly thereafter our Constitution are considered some of the most revolutionary and powerful ideas that were ever committed to paper, and especially ideas to found a government on. And so going forward, our Declaration and our Constitution would become kind of a blueprint for other countries that would do this after us, colonies breaking away from the countries that controlled them and establishing their own nations. Um, but we also have this idea in our country of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States is characterized by a distinct set of ideas such as liberty, democracy, and we tend to think of ourselves as being better than other places in the world because of these ideas. We in the United States, we are not very quick to criticize our country. And especially on your extreme far right end of the spectrum, the idea that you would criticize the country or you would criticize military action or, like we're seeing right now, the idea that you would criticize the police. Some people think that these are unacceptable to do. Other people would say, it is the most patriotic thing you can do is to criticize your country, recognize where it is wrong, and try and fix it. So we don't agree on these ideas, and that is a difficult thing when you're trying to run a country for 350 million people. So, and that's what we're going to talk about, what these ideas mean. So the first is liberty. And liberty to me is a word that has lost a bit of its meaning. Not because it doesn't mean what it used to mean, mainly because people throw it around without really defining what it is. And so, you see people like, my liberty, don't mess with my liberty, my freedom, and t-shirts and all that kind of stuff. But you ask them what liberty is, and, you might get some really ridiculous answers. And so some people define liberty as freedom. Well, freedom of what? At its core in the Declaration and in the Constitution, we tend to talk about freedom in the idea that people should be able to pursue what is going to make them happy and what is going to make them successful, and that they should be able to do that without interference from other people, including government. So it's where that idea of the land of the free comes from. That this is why immigrants have, come to the United States for, throughout our history, is to pursue that freedom to, make your fortune, start a business, have a family, whatever it is that's going to make you happy as an individual. You are pretty much free to do it here in the United States, provided it does not infringe on someone else's rights. Now, there's different ideas here. One is negative liberty, freedom from constraints or interference of others. So, government protects your rights and without fear of punishment. That you should be able to be as successful as you want and that nobody should hold you back. So let's look at what's happening in our country right now. We have a very difficult situation with COVID 19 and what states are doing to balance public safety and economic strength and economic health in our communities. So you look at someone who may own a bar. Here in Texas, Governor Abbott issued an order closing bars, saying that bars have facilitated the spread of COVID 19, and because they are not deemed essential, he has ordered them to close. Now, does that violate the liberty of the people who own those bars? That is a difficult question. So, there's a very strong argument to be made for the fact that it does, because we are telling these individuals your particular type of business cannot operate right now, which in turn means you can't make money, which in turn means you can't pay your employees, pay your mortgage. We've seen a lot of businesses go out of business during the pandemic. But then we have to balance that with, public health. If we allow places to stay open and more people get COVID 19 and the pandemic gets larger and more unmanageable, then not only will bars have to close, but every business will have to close down again and we'll be in another lockdown. So, this is the predicament that government is in. So in this situation, does government have the right to, infringe on the rights of those bar owners in the interest of the greater good? So this is a question that we're dealing with as a country because we have very different ideas on this. Your conservatives want to allow businesses to stay open and believe that the economic damage that we'll take from this is not worth it. In light of the pandemic. And then, on the left, you have more the interest of public safety, that we have to put the needs of the many before the needs of the few. But government is also not doing much to help those people who, need help right now, whether it's through economic, loans or tax breaks or whatever it is. So we have a government that's not functioning as ideally as we would like it to be functioning during this crisis, which is leading to a lot of these conflicts getting out of hand. And so, but that's negative liberty. Should those business owners be able to operate free from the constraints of government, regardless of the fact that we're in a pandemic? That's a tough situation to be in and a tough idea to kind of grapple with. Positive liberty, on the other side, the ability and provision of basic necessities to pursue one's own goals. This is what we talked about in the last chapter about the idea of welfare. That for any citizen to be able to pursue freedom and liberty and happiness, certain needs have to be met. What are those needs? Food, shelter, education. Some people believe healthcare falls in this category. So this positive liberty would be the idea that government should make sure that these needs are taken care of for citizens if they cannot take care of them themselves, so that they can at least not have to worry about those basic necessities and then pursue an education, to get a better job, to move out of their situation into a better situation. So, but we argue about this as a country. Again, there's a very distinct split here when it comes to political ideology. if you look at people on the left, they think government should provide more than it does right now. That welfare programs should be expanded, especially because of what's happening right now with the pandemic. That, we got many of us got the stimulus, from the government. Um, the $1,200 plus if you have children and things like that. Um, as a way to kind of get people through what we thought was going to be just a couple of months of difficulty. But now we see, like we said, we see businesses are closing down. We have, lots of people who are unemployed because their profession can't function right now. We have all kinds of problems, like kids who aren't eating because they can't be at school, and that's where they got most of their food. So, someone who believes in this idea of positive liberty would say that the government should step in and provide for these types of things so that people can worry about the other aspects of their life. But on the flip side of that, you know, there's the conservative, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of mentality that everybody should have, if you work hard, you'll be able to get the things that you need. And while that may be true, it's not true right now, because we have people who did work hard and pull themselves up by their bootstraps whose businesses are failing because they can't operate. So this is a tough thing, and we have polarization in our government right now. We have a Republican controlled Senate and a Democrat controlled House, and not a whole lot is getting done because they don't want to compromise or compromise their ideals. And so this is what is kind of, this is what makes citizens dissatisfied and have that notion that government isn't doing anything. Is, these ideologies create this polarization and lack of action. Now, Franklin Roosevelt, probably one of our, definitely believed in positive liberty, and he said that there are four freedoms that Americans should fight for: the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. Now, from want is the interesting one, because that kind of goes into those notions of welfare, that citizens shouldn't have to worry about food, shelter, education, and FDR believed in that the government should provide health care as well. Um, but those ideas aren't the same for everybody, and so that's why liberty and freedom and things like that are very difficult to define, because they mean different things to different people, and they can mean different things at different points in our history. If you look at the example of slavery, the idea of what African Americans wanted as freedom was simply to not be enslaved. But at that same time, the idea of freedom to a white landowning male would be a very different concept. During segregation, freedom and liberty meant different things for communities of color than they did for white communities. Marriage rights, citizenship, family rights, all of these things go into the idea of liberty. So that's why it is such a difficult thing to define, because it doesn't mean the same thing to every single person. Self rule. This kind of goes along with liberty as well. The idea of how much authority should government have. There are lots of people, if you are of the political ideology of being conservative or libertarian, uh, they don't like what they consider government having too much power, too much authority. But at its core, in our Constitution, the power of government flows from the power of the people. The government only has as much power as its people give it. That is kind of the defining thing of democracy. But we have to participate to tell the government how we want to be governed. So we have to vote. We have to have our voices heard, protest, whatever it takes. And so there's a few things that it's done through the legislative process to reinforce this. Referendums and initiatives kind of go hand in hand, but these allow citizens to propose laws, propose ideas, or recall ideas that they don't like, and vote on it. So let's say I believe that as a country we should have um, free college education for everybody, or at least free junior college education, where your first 2 years of college are paid for. Well, we can, they can talk about that in the legislature. They can talk about that at the state level. But if citizens really want this done, they can start a petition, push for a referendum, get these things put on local ballots, which then work their way up to the state and then to the federal government to demand that this be done. And that gives citizens a way to propose their own ideas of legislation. So we could put that on the ballot. Do you think the federal government should use taxpayer money to pay for college education for 2 years for every American citizen? And then it's a simple yes or no vote. And if the majority of Americans agree with this, then that tells Congress this is something that is important to the people and they need to address. Sunshine laws are a little different. This is laws that say that the public has access to watch our lawmakers in action, to access government records, to view the transcripts of proceedings. So nothing can be done in the dark. It all has to be done out in the open. I mean, if you flip through your cable channels, you'll see C-SPAN. C-SPAN is there. It covers the legislative sessions. Most people don't watch it because it will bore you to tears, but it's there. And so we have access to all of how these proceedings are happening. So nothing is done in the dark without our knowledge and without our consent. Now we know that's not 100% true because some things do happen that way. And again, that's a failure of the ideal way that our system is supposed to work. Republic, we talked about the idea that we have so many citizens that we can't all vote on everything directly, so we elect people to go represent our interest. The problem is when those people are no longer representing the people, but corporate interest or lobbyist or special interest and things like that. That's where there's a breakdown in the system, and it's our job as voters to hold those people accountable. Going back to the founding, I love this quote from James Madison. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. But we're not, and we know we're not, and we don't agree. And so government exists to help us mitigate these issues, to come to compromises and agreements. But even at its, we have this amazingly designed system, and it still doesn't work sometimes. And that's what creates problems for us as average citizens. Limited government. So how much authority should government have? If we go all the way back to the founding, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, this was a big disagreement. Who should have the most authority when it comes to government? Should it be the federal government? Should it be the state government? Which one, states' rights versus, the power of the federal government? Americans distrust centralized leadership, and that's just especially at the founding, that's just because we came from a government controlled by a king, and we didn't want that again. We didn't want one person at the top telling us all what we had to do. So we don't like centralizing too much power in one person or one branch or whatever it is. The problem is, though, is when you decentralize leadership, getting things done becomes much slower. In a centralized system, you have a monarch or you have a dictator or a leader who gets to make decisions, and those decisions get put into action. The American idea of government is that all men are created equal and given rights by God. No one can take those rights away. And so we have to essentially argue over what we want and come to compromised solutions to those problems. And Americans will say that they don't want centralized government leadership and government authority. But the paradox throughout our history is that we have kept giving federal government more power, especially in times where we are in crisis or there is a big problem facing us as a country. if you look throughout our history at the moments when government assumed more power than it had had before, the big ones are the Civil War. When the country was at war with itself, the Union and Lincoln assumed more powers than they had had before because of this crisis. The Great Depression, World War II, 9/11, all of these moments where Americans are kind of unsure about their future, kind of scared of the state of the world, we tend to give government more authority because we want government to protect us. And so every time government has assumed more authority, it has never relinquished that authority. So federal government has become more and more powerful throughout our history as a country. Now, the two sides disagree on this idea. When we talk about the right and the right is conservatives and the left is liberals, but we know even within those two ideologies, we have people who are far off the end of the spectrum for both of those. We have people who are more towards the center, who are moderates, and everything in between. But kind of at its core, conservatives tend to believe in a reduced government authority. They don't like government spending. They believe more in personal responsibility for solving your problems. Traditional moral values, and when we say traditional moral values, we typically mean Christian moral values. Secure borders and a strong national defense, strong military. Liberals, on the other hand, tend to believe more in diversity, using government programs to help solve social problems like poverty, that the government should intervene in the economy when it is needed, and that people's right to a lifestyle based on their own social or moral positions should be defended by government. So that's kind of the core of the differences, but there's everything in between, and so these aren't 100% descriptive of everyone's political ideology. Now, individualism. We talked about individualism in the last chapter. This is one of those things that is difficult for us as a country, and like I said, we're seeing that right now, coming together for the well-being of our country as a whole versus our own individual well-being. We have this individualist streak throughout our history that the individual, not the society, is responsible for their own well-being. So you as an individual are responsible for making sure that you're fed, clothed, taken care of, educated, all that kind of stuff, that it is your own personal responsibility. The problem with that is that then we forget, or sometimes not forget, but we just purposefully don't care, that the system that we exist in has not been fair historically to everyone in our society, and then therefore, how is someone supposed to be individually responsible for their own well-being if their basic human rights are not even recognized? And so that's the dilemma that we have faced and are still facing as a country. In a social democracy, this would be kind of an ideal for a lot of people, that government policy should ensure all citizens are comfortably cared for within the context of a capitalist economy. We have a capitalist economy. We are based on spending money, and those who create an idea or a product or whatever it is, their success will depend on the demand in the market for what they have to offer. And that system can be very cruel to those at the bottom end of the tax bracket, those who live in poverty. Capitalism a lot of times emphasizes winners and losers, but the people who are in the loser column still have needs that need to be taken care of. Things like healthcare, retirement, unemployment, paid maternity leave. These are things that we either have or we're fighting for or we want to see changes in, because in our system here in the United States, there's a lot of inequality. Let's take healthcare. Healthcare is the easiest one to talk about. In our country, healthcare is tied to your job. And so the better your job, the more money you make, probably the better health care you have. But we know that people that live in poverty are more likely to have more pressing health concerns and not have the means to take care of them. And they probably have the worst health insurance available if they have health insurance at all, because health insurance outside of your job is insanely expensive. Other countries do this differently. Healthcare is not tied to your job, it's tied to you being a citizen of that country. Everyone pays taxes, those taxes are allocated for these types of issues. So, in Canada, you pay more in taxes, but you don't pay hardly anything for healthcare. Paid maternity leave. In many European countries, you pay more in taxes, but when you get pregnant and you have a child, all of that is taken care of. You get, 9 months to a year off for your child's first year of life, things like that. The thing is, we're not paying that much different in taxes compared to, say, somewhere like Canada or France or Sweden or places like that. We just don't get the same thing for our taxes. We get roads, we get water, we get infrastructure, things like that. But we don't get some of these things that provide for our basic needs that other countries do. And so we're seeing a lot of discussion about this now, especially with the way our healthcare system has become, exorbitantly expensive, that where even if you're not poor, even if you are middle class, upper middle class, a health crisis can bankrupt someone. And so in a social democracy, which is more kind of like what Canada and Europe is, that the taxes we pay should be allocated to take care of these problems. In these types of countries, they have more of a collectivist mentality that we are all French or we are all Canadian, and that we are entitled to this care by virtue of just being a citizen of this country. We pay our taxes in. This is how our taxes are given back to us. The United States, our individualist mentality actually has us work against some of these ideas. There are people who do not want a government-run healthcare system for one reason or another. They don't believe it would be adequate. They don't like the idea of paying more taxes, that they'll work hard enough that they can take care of their own problems. They have their own insurance, things like that. So, and like I said, this idea of individualism comes from our early days where, there was lots of opportunity, people pushing westward. They were very separated from the rest of the civil society on the East Coast. And so it creates this individualist mentality that the only person I have to count on is myself. And that is kind of leaked into the way we govern ourselves, the way we see social problems, that kind of thing. And there's a lot of arguments out there, different researchers you can read. If you're interested, I can post a list, a reading list or something. But there are some theorists and thinkers that believe that America is too diverse to ever develop a true sense of solidarity. Do y'all believe that's true? Are we too diverse and too different to ever do that? This quote, I like this quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I am inevitably my brother's keeper because I am my brother's brother. That's more of a collectivist mentality, that how well you're doing, I should care about how well you're doing, because how well you're doing can also have effects on how well I'm doing. That essentially we're all kind of in this together. The American dream. This is one that our baby boomers, they got to experience. The idea of the American dream, the first person to use this phrase is a sociologist named James Truslow Adams in 1931. So this would be about a little under a decade before World War II starts. The idea of the American dream is a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to ability or achievement. So, break that down. That everyone should have this ability to be richer, to be fulfilled, and have opportunity, but that opportunity comes with your ability to work hard to achieve it. Gordon Wood had a take on it: make money, get ahead. That almost sounds like hip hop. Make money, get ahead. Um, so the idea that everyone in America should be able to make their money, create their opportunity as long as they're willing to work for it. Um, but what does that mean to each individual person? That's different. And then kind of after this comes the idea of the American dream being a house with a white picket fence, a family with two kids and a dog and a car and all that kind of stuff. But is that the American dream for us today? What does your American dream look like? And do you think it's possible? Can you achieve it the way that, say, when the baby boomers were growing up and they graduated high school and went to college, yeah, they could all go to college because, a semester at college might cost you a couple $100. And then when they got done with college, they all got their dream career. They all bought a house because houses were affordable and they didn't have student debt. But that reality is very different for us now that we are adults and will be leaving college and entering the workforce. Where many of us will enter that system with thousands of dollars of debt because of our college education. And so we're not starting at the same point that they started at. And so our American dream may be very different from what theirs was. Um, but going back to the founders, Ben Franklin established these rules for American success. And so this is something else you could write about, whether these ideals were good for America. His first one: be frugal. A penny saved is a penny earned. Probably still good advice. Work hard. No gains without pains. Be steady. Little strokes fell great oaks. Be bold. God helps those who help themselves. And be morally upright. Leave your vices, though ever so dear. Which is kind of funny for Ben Franklin, because if you don't know much about him, he was a drunk and a womanizer. So he never left his vices behind. But there's a couple of questions here on this slide that would be interesting to write about. Is the American dream still possible? Or do you believe the system that we exist in today is rigged against us and it's not something that we'll be able to achieve? Or what does your American dream look like? And is that something possible? Does the American dream promote the wrong values? Does it promote materialism over, compassion and really empathy and things like that? So there's a couple of ideas to write about as well. Now, what goes into the American dream, at its core is money. We're a capitalist system, so money makes the system work. If you have the current edition of the book, this chart is on page 42, but if not, it's right here. The first chart looks at income growth from 1949 to 1979. So if you look at this chart over here, you can see that the highest amount of income growth in that time period was actually among the bottom 20% of wage earners in our country. So if you were a factory worker, if you were a blue collar worker, your income continued to go up and up and up for this time period. This is after World War II, but before Reagan comes into office in 1981. So you could be a garbage man. You could be a factory worker. You could be, a store clerk, and you made enough money and had income growth potential to support a family, to buy a home. If you talk to some of your grandparents, many of them were able to buy a home, just working a job without a college education. So there was a lot of potential for growth for those in the lower class and the middle class during this time period. And this is the time period your baby boomers grow up in. Now, if you look at where we are, from 1979 to 2014, the income growth potential for those in the bottom 80% of wage earners in our country shrank drastically. And then you hear this idea about the top 1%. If you were a Bernie Sanders fan, you've heard him talk about the top 1%, a lot, and how that is where all the growth is happening. So today, the income growth potential is best if you are already insanely wealthy. And by top 1% in our country, we're talking about billionaires or multi millionaires, that those individuals have far more ability to take the money they have and turn it into more money than someone who is working, at a grocery store, or someone who is, um, you know, a trash man or something like that. So, what does that say about our ability to achieve the American dream? Is the American dream still possible in the way it was for our grandparents or our great grandparents? Now, equality. Equality, again, is another one of those ideas that may mean different things to different people depending on what we're talking about. But equality is just citizens having the same privileges, same status, and same rights before the law. There's three main types of equality that we talk about. Social equality, enjoy the same status in society. This would be things like, you know, gay marriage, civil rights, that we are all treated roughly the same and fairly when it comes to how society treats us. Political equality, all have the same political rights and opportunities. Do we all have the right to vote? Do we all have the right to run for office? Things like that. And then economic equality, there are only small differences in wealth among citizens. Well, if we go back to that chart, we could say that there's a lot of economic equality here. There's not much difference at the top for income growth potential. But if we get to where we are today, you could argue that this is very indicative of economic equality because it's very hard to move among these different percentages. It would be very difficult from someone from the bottom 20% to make it into the top 1%. And that's what we're talking about by economic equality. If we looking at economic equality, if we look at the median CEO pay, in 1965, the CEO of a typical company made about 26 times more than their typical median wage worker. If we look at that today, the CEO of a corporation is probably making 300 to 500 times more than their median average worker. So what does that say about economic equality? We've seen a lot of debates over this. Like we're even unwilling to raise the minimum wage today. The minimum wage hasn't changed in over a decade. And so, that just continues to perpetuate economic inequality. But yet we have, if we look at a company like Amazon, we have someone like Jeff Bezos they're saying that he is on track to become the first trillionaire in human history. And yet you can work for Amazon and make little to nothing in their warehouses. And is that fair? Is that fair to our society and our system for that much of a disparity to exist within a single company? So we all have different opinions about that, and that's something that you can write about as well. But there are a couple of different ideas about equality. The one that Americans tend to agree with is equality of opportunity. And what we mean by that is that every American has the same chance to influence politics or achieve economic success. This is the one that Americans really, we want to believe that this is true, that being born in America, we all have the opportunity to be successful, that we will all get access to an education, that we will all have our basic needs met, and then our chances for success depend on how hard we are willing to work for it. Equality of outcome is the one that Americans tend to not like. And this is the idea that citizens should have roughly equal economic circumstances across the board. So, let's say that in our class, if I said, Okay, everybody in class, uh, at the end of the semester, after you've done all your work and everything, I said, you know what? Regardless of your grades, I'm just going to give everybody the same grade. That would be equality of outcome. Because no matter how hard you worked in the class, I'm going to give everybody the same grade. That would disincentivize a lot of people from working hard if I told you that up front. Because you're like, well, we're all going to get the same grade anyway. Equality of opportunity, though, discounts the fact that we don't all start from the same place. Someone's equality of opportunity, if they're born into a wealthy family, is probably much higher than someone who is born into poverty. And so there's problems with both of these ideas. Neither one is without its flaws. But equality of opportunity is what Americans tend to believe in the most. Now, just a couple of questions on this idea. How much inequality, income inequality, is too much? Are we seeing too much income inequality right now? Or is there such a thing? Do you believe that's a thing? And does severe income inequality undermine the American idea of equality? So, what do you think about that? A couple of ideas for you to write on there if you want. All right. Freedom of religion. Now, this one gets people in our country very fired up. So, just looking at some statistics for the United States, 87% of Americans say they believe in God. 54% belong to an organized group or organized religion. 46% attend religious services at least once a month. But the fastest growing group of people in the United States when it comes to this issue are people who declare themselves religiously unaffiliated. This would be atheist, agnostic, or no particular religious belief. Now, one of the problems that we have had as a country is recognizing that one religion should not dominate the conversation. True freedom of religion should mean that you are free to practice or not practice any religion of your choice, regardless of what someone else thinks about it. But throughout most of our history, because Christianity is the most represented religion in our country, we have had a problem with the recognition of religions other than Christianity or the recognition of people who don't believe in God. So we look at the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. We'll go into this more in the next chapter, but essentially what this says is um, the United States cannot declare a single religion the national religion that everyone has to practice, nor can it prevent someone from practicing a religion that they choose to practice. So the government has to stay out of this. And Thomas Jefferson obviously is famous for the idea of separation between church and state. Now, this isn't actually in the Constitution. It was just one of Jefferson's ideas that he talked about. But essentially, the amendments create this idea of separation of church and state, that government should not be in the business of promoting one religion over another or giving favors to one religion, but we know that's not the case. But even our founding fathers disagreed on what the freedom of religion truly meant. Um, so, a couple of questions. What does the Constitution allow? 2, should religion be enforced in certain issues? Religion today has become intertwined with political participation. And religion and religious ideas have contributed to the idea of American exceptionalism, the idea that we were the chosen people of God for manifest destiny. We were superior to the Russians during the Cold War because we believed in God. The Middle East, a lot of the Middle East conflicts, we have this conflict between Christianity and Islam. And so, what is religion's role when it comes to politics? Many people would say it shouldn't have a role. But we know that we have done a terrible job of separating the two, from each other. So this is an argument that we're still having today, whether it's over the issue of abortion, whether it's over, shutting down churches because of the pandemic, whatever it is, religious freedom comes up quite a bit. But a lot of times when people are saying the words religious freedom, they don't mean the freedom of other people's religions. They solely mean the freedom of their own religion. Issues like prayer in school, prayers at school events, posting the Ten Commandments in classrooms and government buildings. We'll talk about these more in another chapter. So, how do these ideas affect our politics? Political culture. This is the orientation of citizens of a country toward politics. And so, all of these ideas will affect our political points of view. Your notion of equality and where you are in that system, your notion of or what religion you practice, what you believe liberty to be, these will all influence your political ideology. And we know that we as a country will change and evolve based on some of these ideas. If we look at, the idea of liberty and freedom, that meant something very different in 1850 than it does in 2020. Who could participate? Who could run for office? That all was affected by the idea of liberty and freedom and who was recognized. If we look at what political culture is, so anthropologists, people who study society and culture and things like that, they define culture as the stories a group tells about itself. So if we look at our political culture today, what story are we telling the rest of the world about what it means to be American? So what is our culture? What is our political culture today? Also, institutional perspective, that rules built into the system will shape political behavior. Our system is designed to work a certain way. We recognize the authority of government. There's checks and balances. We respect them. But James Madison, if we look at one of his statements that I believe is very pertinent today, enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. Now, I will be upfront with you. I am not a fan of President Trump. And it does not have anything to do with the fact that he is a Republican. There are many Republicans that I respect. There are many Democrats that I respect. It has nothing to do with political party. It just has to do with the fact that I do not think he is a qualified person for the job he has been given. And so I think this statement speaks to that. Our system works because we recognize the importance of the institutions that we have created. But if we have an individual who does not recognize the authority of those institutions and that person is in charge of the country, then what does that do to the rest of the country? So if we have a president who thinks that the rules don't apply to him, then it creates this idea among the citizens that the rules don't apply to them either. And then what does that do to society? Can we really hold a society together once we think that the system does or the rules don't apply to us? And that's, I think, some of what we're dealing with today. This is just my opinion. You don't have to agree with me. And just know that when you're writing your discussion post, you do not have to agree with anything I say. I in fact, encourage you to argue with me. But, our system is a very delicate thing. It hinges on the idea that people respect it, recognize the rules and the authority, and that's what keeps society civil. And so if that breaks down, then do we have a society? It's a very difficult question. So what do you think is stronger in our system today? Our government, our culture, or the institution? Is our political culture changing in a way that is weakening our government and the institutions that we believed in the past? Something else interesting to write about. I give you a lot of questions here, so there's a lot to write about. Then this last slide is just a quote I like from President Obama. We are not a collection of red states and blue states. We are the United States of America. And, that goes back to that idea of, if to kind of keep society together, we have to think of ourselves as everybody being American. But the individualist tendencies in our country have kind of taken us away from that collectivist thinking. And so I think that's the reason why we're seeing a lot of conflict and a lot of polarization in our country today. And it'll be interesting to see where we move forward from this, because we are definitely living through interesting times. And I think our society is going to change one way or the other, coming out of this pandemic and coming out of the protests that we're having and all of that kind of stuff. And so, what kind of country do we want to be when this is all over with?